Before we start the show, we want you to know, in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic, international ministries like ABWE are facing unique challenges. Our crisis team is working around the clock to evacuate, advise, or care for missionaries from East Asia to Italy and everywhere in between. Your support is critical at this time. We'll share more later in the program, but you can go right now to abwe.org/global gospel fund. Consider a gift and join us in prayer. We also wanted to let you know there's still a way for you to join what would have been our live lunch panel in Louisville. Stay tuned for more information later in the show. Today, we think of religion as being that which seeks to answer life's biggest questions, but folk religions seek to control life using spiritism. These traditions across the world mix with other religious systems and never lie far beneath the surface of other major belief systems, including Islam. So how can Christians explain the gospel to folk Muslims and other spiritists?
With Muslims that are of the folk variety, often we want to approach Muslims with the sort of 1, 2, 3, 4 progression that works fine with people that think logically in a progression. But with those that are afraid of evil spirits, then you can present verses about how Christ cast out demons, how Christ had dominion over the powers, Christ as the one that is all-powerful, and then you can show them how they might be saved. They need to see how this Jesus can solve the why questions that they have.
Former missionary and professor of missions, Dr. Robin Hadaway, brings expert answers on today's show. Welcome to the Missions Podcast, the show that explores your hard questions on missions, theology, and practice to help goers think and thinkers go. I'm Alex Kochman, Director of Advancement and Mobilization for ABWE International, joined by Scott Dunford, West Coast Mobilizer and Lead Church Planter for Redeemer Church in Fremont, California. And today, we are not discussing the coronavirus, which might be a welcome piece of news for many of you guys that are listening. And even though there's lots of implications of that, it's something that we plan on continuing to address. Scott, one of the things that I enjoy most is the fact that we get to continue to record this remotely as we've already been doing, and talk about all sorts of topics that are still always abidingly relevant.
Yeah, and there are so many things to be talking about. And as you talk to especially those who are veterans, in missions, you realize, some of the things that we're facing here are new to maybe myself or you, Alex, but they're not necessarily new around the world. I was just talking to our next guest about some of the things that he's faced in his many years of ministry that are far worse than this, even. And so I'm excited to have one of my professors at Midwestern and a veteran missionary. He's served with the IMB for many, many years, served at Midwestern for many years, opened up many parts of North Africa, and has been involved in leadership at a lot of different levels with the IMB, Dr. Robin Hadaway. So Robin, Dr. Hadaway, good to have you with us. Thank you for joining us. Can you just tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got into missions, and then we're going to dive into this topic of folk Islam.
So great to be with you today. I've already taught one class as we are teaching online due to the coronavirus situation. And it's good to join you in this format, and I want to welcome all the listeners. So I was born in Nashville, Tennessee. We moved, though, to Tallahassee, Florida when I was 5 years old, and so I grew up there, graduated from the Florida High School, which is part of Florida State University. I went to college at the University of Memphis, and then to seminary at Dallas Seminary, and then Southwestern Seminary, where I graduated. In between college and seminary, though, I spent 4 years in the Air Force and was stationed in Texas, Florida, Alaska, and Nevada. And so I've got experience in all those places. But then my seminary career, once I finished seminary, I wanted to pastor in the West. And so even though I was born and raised in the South, I went out to California where I pastored in Los Angeles County. I pastored First Southern Baptist Church in Monterey Park, which is the first Chinese majority city in the United States. There's about 50,000 people. at that time, there was about 40,000 Chinese. I think it's a greater percentage now. And so my church, we had a Mandarin, a Cantonese, and a Spanish-speaking congregation that met in our building, and I pastored the Legacy Church, which was at that time the larger one, but since that time, the two Chinese churches are bigger. So I thought I was involved in missions there in Southern California, and I certainly was. But my wife and I went to Glorieta, New Mexico, to the International Missions Week. We heard a speaker talk about 100 churches being planted in Tanzania, and we just were called together there to go. Now, I just arrived at my church, so I felt like I couldn't leave. I stayed there 4 years, but we went to Tanzania in 1983, 84, and served there in Tanzania. Then we went to North Africa to work with an unreached people in East Africa. Then we came home for a couple of years, pastored in Phoenix, 2 years due to a health issue with one of our children. Then went back overseas. And then after a few years, the International Mission Board asked me to do something kind of unusual. After working in Swahili in Tanzania and Arabic in North Africa, they asked me to go lead 400 missionaries in Brazil, Uruguay, and Paraguay. And so
naturally.
Naturally. In their great wisdom, a reorganization throws everything.
Yeah. Well, I've got a good friend that served in Tanzania and then moved to oversee Western Europe. So, that makes a lot of sense too. So yes.
Yeah. So we had a great ministry there, but our third child's mentally handicapped, and when she got to be about 15, it made sense for us to come back to the States so she could have special education. And so the former president of Midwestern asked me to come and be the missions professor at Midwestern in 2003. So I've been teaching. At the end of July, it'll be 17 years that I've been at Midwestern.
Wow. Well, I want to dive into this. Scott and I are partial to the topic of Islam. It's a burden that he and I both share in different ways, and it's something that comes up on this show a lot. But to zoom out a little bit as well, and this is going to sound like a forced segue, but it may not be. I've been serving with ABWE in a capacity on our crisis management team. And it helps you to see through everything happening with this particular coronavirus pandemic, how easily information that spreads through the news quickly becomes urban myth and quickly becomes something that we have to address altogether. And you realize just how these sorts of things spread and what's myth and what's rumor. And that almost makes me think, how do worldviews get shaped, whether it's what we would call in contemporary society, urban legend. But I think there's a parallel in the realm of, we talk about religion and we usually just mean formal religions, but there's so much of religion that is informal, that's folk religion. And that's a big category and maybe not the most accurate assessment, but help us understand what is folk religion and specifically what is folk Islam. It's not as formal and it is its own thing, right?
That's right. And the genesis of my understanding came when I arrived in Tanzania. And in northwestern Tanzania, we had probably 20% Muslims, but the majority were what we would call traditional religion, which is the old term for animist. Now, in my work at the University of South Africa, where I received my PhD, I learned quickly that Africans don't like being called animist. And so the word they prefer is traditional religion, which is a synonym for folk religion. And I learned that the traditional religion that we normally associate with animism had blended into other religions. And so we have folk Christianity, which all of us know about the snake handlers in the mountains. I won't say which states. I don't want to offend anybody, but some of them are in my state where I was born, Tennessee, but I won't mention any other states. But this folk religion kind of spreads out and is particularly strong with Islam because Islam seems to do very well with allowing the religions that they encounter to take their practices, and they're fine with them blending in as long as they recognize the 5 pillars of Islam and they still respect Muhammad and the Quran. Then Islam is pretty easy with allowing other religions to keep some of their old practices.
So what makes it unique? Why does it stand out as something that needs to be dealt with differently than just traditional Islam?
Backing up a little bit to answer your first question, which was, what is folk religion? So Paul Hebert is the one that wrote a book in the 1990s, and I took Paul Hebert when I attended Fuller Seminary for 2 courses in Southern California. And I had Paul Hebert when he was still a professor at Fuller before he moved to Trinity. And of course, he passed away about 8 years ago. But Paul Hebert describes folk religion as a tradition of the religion of the common people. And it might be parts of their animistic or traditional religion past. It might be practices that they have imported, like in Asia, some parts of Hinduism or Buddhism will make their way into folk Islam in Asia. And so it's kind of this mixture, and we see this mixture of folk religion in the New Age movement, where people just kind of create a do-it-yourself religion, and religion is kind of private opinion. Now, folk Islam, to answer your other question, is what happens is a lot of places in the world have little medical care, have little in the way of modern conveniences, and so people have problems they need to solve. And so high religion, as orthodox religion is called, and then low religion, or as folk religion is called, low religion or folk religion answers the questions of the everyday person, such as, why did my wife die? Why are my children sick? Why did a tsunami come and wipe away my village? Why did the coronavirus strike here more than there? And why did this person get sick and not that person? And so these questions, these why questions, sometimes are hard for our own congregants to answer. And so it's even more so in Islam, where Islam is just submission, but some people aren't so good with just submitting. They want to know the real reason. Why did this happen? And so what happens is people will go to a shaman who may be an imam also. And in folk Islam, you have people that are called different. They have different names. They call fikra in North Africa. They have other names for them in different places, but they'll ask these people questions like, has someone given me the evil eye? And so they'll respond to that. Yes, you have been, the evil eye has come upon you, and you need to grind up the Quran, say one verse or one page of the Quran, burn it, grind it up, burn it, and then put it in a glass of tea or coffee or water, and you drink that, and then that will cure you of whatever evil befell you because of the evil eye. So that's what folk Islam does, and you use a different verse for, let's say, I read an article about a woman that wanted to get her husband to divorce his second wife because she was the first wife. And so there was another potion that was given where she was to drink a potion mixed with honey in order to get her husband to divorce his second wife. And so you have all of these life things that come at you that folk religionists will solve with, say, a folk remedy.
You wrote an article, this is a while back now, talking about how to best reach different expressions of folk religion. And you explained some types of evangelism, like apologetics, for instance, which I understand that. When I was, wanting to reach Muslims, the first thing I would do is go out and read books on explaining the Quran, explaining ways that, the Bible was, more accurate and more true and the Quran was faulty and those kind of things. And trying to poke holes in the belief system and understand their belief system. But in this article, you describe that with folk Muslims, some of those approaches just aren't nearly as effective. What do you recommend as someone who wants to engage in those areas of the world? What are effective methods? Why doesn't things like apologetics or polemics work in the same way as we would expect them to work? And what do you recommend in someone wanting to engage with a folk religionist, especially in folk Islam?
Yeah, you're certainly right. And I was in South Asia just 3 weeks ago, returned 2 weeks ago because I was overseas. I was in self-quarantine. And just got out on Monday, so this situation is real to me. And while I was there, we went and visited mosques, and we visited Hindu and Buddhist temples. They had them all there, and we were at a folk Muslim durga, they call them, which is a place that. It's not a mosque, it's a tomb, and they'll have a number of saints that are buried there, and people will go to that mosque, those tombs to pray because they believe that the saints' presence have some sort of baraka, which means power. And so they derive that from praying at the tombs. Well, this has nothing to do with Orthodox Islam. And so when you're there with these people, you realize that, okay, when you're talking about the Quran and the 5 pillars of Islam and Muhammad and some of the arguments that we might use to just talk about the inspiration of the Quran, how it's inspired or not inspired, we would say it wouldn't be. The life of Muhammad, you don't always want to get into that the first thing with a Muslim, but there are some aspects to his life that would show that perhaps he wasn't the best leader in the world. And the doctrines of Islam, one of the things you could ask a Muslim about assurance of salvation and all of that. But as those that write about folk Islam, Phil Parshall is one of those that's written about folk Islam. And we would say that with Muslims that are of the folk variety, that apologetics often is beside the point. Now, we're not saying that those arguments wouldn't work later as you're working with a folk Muslim. But many times a folk Muslim wants to answer those why questions. And so I say that it might be a good idea to introduce some other verses first. And so if you're dealing with someone that's afraid of evil spirits, evil forces, and maybe the evil eye, that you want to use perhaps verses like the Son of Man has come and destroy the works of the devil, and use that as your intro. So I'm not saying that you don't use Bible verses about sin, judgment, and salvation. It's just that you might want to begin with a verse that speaks to where they are with their need. Many Muslims have the shame-honor perspective. And so I like to use the verse about that Christ speaks about Christ, that he despised the shame. And so you can approach Muslims through different verses that speak about their spiritual need. We want to approach Muslims with the sort of guilt innocence perspective that we have as Westerners, which is the logical format of A, God loves you, B, Christ died for your sin, and then C, Christ rose from the dead and you need to believe in Christ. Well, 1, 2, 3, 4 progression works fine with people that think logically in a progression. But with those that are coming from being afraid of evil spirits, verses about how Christ cast out demons and how Christ had dominion over the powers, then you can present Christ as the one that is all-powerful, and then you can show them how they might be saved. No one is saved, of course, by casting out demons, but they sometimes they need to see how this Jesus can solve the why questions that they have.
One of the interesting things about Islam is the areas not just of overlap with Christianity, but sharp distinction, right? So you have this understanding of an Isa figure, a Jesus-like figure, and there's certainly overlap with the biblical accounts, but the common Islamic understanding is that he didn't die on the cross. Someone was made to take his appearance. God brought the prophet Isa directly up to heaven, and he'll return someday, but he'll also live and die, and he will go down in history and in the final analysis as a mere human prophet sent by Allah. So that's some of the difficulties. Do you find that with folk Islam, there's the same kind of default knee-jerk, well, the Quran says this about Jesus, therefore your gospel can't be true? Or is there a different set of assumptions about Isa? Or is it not even something of which many people in the folk Islam variety are even aware?
Yeah, that's a good question. And see, with folk Islam in my classes, when I talk about this, there's a spectrum. And so someone isn't just either an orthodox or a folk. There's kind of a progression or a spectrum. So you'll have some that only will look to folk Islam in a crisis. And then there's others that, they just practice folk Islam every single day. A good friend of mine, he teaches at Gateway Seminary, and I won't say his last name because I want to make sure he would agree to share his story, but his name is Eddie. Last name starts with a P. And so Eddie's and his wife were in language school in Jordan, and they had some neighbors who were very educated. One was a nurse. The other one was a professional of some kind. And they were a young couple, and so Eddie and his wife, Merla, were sharing the Lord with them and making some progress and so forth. But they wanted to have children, this couple, this Muslim couple there, and they couldn't get pregnant. And so they tried the fertility, and they tried just all the different kind of things that Western medicine would say. Nothing worked, and so finally they turned to the shaman. And they went to the shaman. The shaman told them, if you'll slaughter a sheep and let the blood of the sheep come down on the roof of the apartment complex, then you'll have a baby or get pregnant. Well, they tried that, and 2 months later, she was pregnant. So I tell people, that, Satan has some power, and sometimes these shamans, when they do something, I believe somehow the devil is allowed to give some results, which kind of strings people along. So it does happen that. So I would say, in answer to your question, there's this spectrum, but there's a lot of people that are Orthodox Muslims that would say they would never practice folk Islam until there's a crisis.
Well, we have a lot more that we need to dive into with Dr. Hadaway, but first we're going to take a quick break. Hey listeners, you may have heard about our event that was planned in Louisville during T4G. Things have changed, and now there's a way for you all to join us online. On Monday, April 27th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time, join us on YouTube and Facebook Live for the local church and the nations. And we'll still have some brilliant guests, right, Scott?
Yeah, guests that you're familiar with, guests that we've had on the show, like Zane Pratt, Darren Carlson, Brooks Buser, Paul Davis, John Clausen will join us to answer, when Jesus said to disciple all the nations, what did he mean by that? And making it practical, what can ordinary churches do about that?
Go to missionspodcast.com/T4G for all the information as it becomes available. So tune in on April 27th for the local church and the nations. Brought to you by the Missions Podcast. A special message from ABWE President Paul Davis.
ABWE missionaries are coming beside the lost and the hurting around the world. And through the Global Gospel Fund, they're pulling people from the darkness and training them as leaders. They're planting churches, and they're even beginning their own missions movements. You may already support one ABWE missionary. Would you consider a gift to the Global Gospel Fund to support all 1,000 of our missionaries? Thank you for that.
Become a partner today at abwe.org/Global Gospel Fund.
Training is the biggest common denominator, and people who make it through the first 2 years and people who don't.
Brooks Buser, president of Radius International.
Radius is a 10-month intensive training school that trains students who are going to church plants among the last 3,100 unreached groups left in the world. The driving burden is really to see every language group reached with a really strong, lasting New Testament church.
Okay, so why should someone attend Radius International?
I would say someone should attend Radius because we see missionaries that don't make it because they weren't expecting the challenges that were coming at them. Everyone's going to hit hurdles. It's what you do when you hit those hurdles. And if you've had those challenges at Radius, you get to see those challenges. You get to experience some of them in the environment in Tijuana. And you also have capable staff that have a background and can guide you through a lot of those hurdles. And so you tend to do much better. I'm one of the team leaders. He says there's just something different about Radius graduates. They understand and they get through things a lot faster, and they do better on the field when the hard times come.
What's your final challenge?
Go to radiusinternational.org, radiusinternational.org.
And we're back with Dr. Robin Hadaway. And Scott, you had a good question just about methods and what's most effective in reaching folk Muslims, but also all sorts of folk religionists.
Yeah, and I just want to pick your brain a little bit too. Do you see more people coming to Christ out of folk Islam as opposed to traditional Islam? Are we seeing a greater movement of Christians out of that background, or is it dispersed evenly? And what are some of the things that you're seeing people use to reach folk Muslims particularly that it's being effective?
Yeah, I think that definitely folk Muslims are more responsive than those of the orthodox variety. But of course, we do see people that come to Christ who are Orthodox Muslims. But David, who works in South Asia, tells me that they find the folk Muslims much more responsive. Now, as far as how to share with folk Muslims, I have mentioned a little bit of that. But I also want to mention another group, because these folk Muslims that I was speaking about in South Asia, they are from the Sufis. Now, the Sufis are interesting. So, and I wish I had a diagram I could explain. You have three major sects in Islam. You have Sunnis, which are 80 to 90%. You have the Shias, who are famous in Iran and Iraq, who are 10%. Then you have the Sufis. And you say, well, that's 100%. Where do the Sufis come from? Well, Sufis are like the charismatics of Islam, just as we have in Christianity, charismatic, Lutherans and Baptists and other denominations. Being charismatic is not a sect of Christianity. It's a perspective that one may have believing in certain things that has to have to do with spirituality that are, so you could be a Baptist or anything else. But in Islam, it's the same thing. So there are Sunni Sufis, there are Shia Sufis, but there are no Sufi Sufis, if I can explain it that way. So what do Sufis believe? Well, Sufism is another subject altogether. So what I've been talking about previously in this podcast is I've been speaking about folk Islam. So folk Islam is mixed with African traditional religion, Asian traditional religion, Arabian traditional religion, all the types of practices that are out there have been mixed with Islam. But Sufism arose early in Islam and as the charismatic focus of Islam. And so Sufis remarkably say this. They say it's not doctrine that matters, but feeling. Does that sound familiar? So today in Christianity, we have the feeling folks that say, well, it's your experience that counts. Sufis are all about experiences. So this is what's interesting, at least. Sufism is one of my favorite subjects because the Sufis in Islam, there are 40 traditional orders of Sufis, and they span the globe. I was in Senegal with leading some students about 10 years ago, and I ran into a Sufi sheikh, and I didn't speak French, but we were able to converse in Arabic. Now, I'm not that great in Arabic, but I was able to converse with him in the language. And he told me he was going to be spending a Ramadan in the capital city of a country in East Africa that has Sharia. And so he was going all the way across Africa to spend Ramadan because he was of the same order that they practiced in this country, North Africa. And that Sufi order is originated in Persia. And so these durgas that you have in South Asia that I visited 3 weeks ago, these are Sufis who are also folk Muslims. So to try to explain it better, there are 2 streams in folk Islam. One stream is African traditional religion. If you can look at folk Islam as a river, one stream that feeds into it is folk Islam. The other stream is Sufism. And of course, there's some intermingling between Sufism and folk Islam or African traditional religion mixed with folk Islam. But Sufis tend to be of 2 types. Sufis, and by the way, this is all in my book, which will be coming out on May 1st, which is a survey of world missions. And so I have a chapter on world missions. I talk about this in a little bit more detail. But there are 2 streams in 2 types of Sufism. There are the ascetics. So the ascetics are those that just want to go off in the desert and meditate. And then the other type of Sufis are what we call the whirling dervish Sufis, the ones that want to sing and to dance and to, not necessarily have a good time, but they want to spin around and show that their hilarity in God. And so these 2 types make up the Sufis. And so how do you reach people like that? Well, the Sufis believe that there are 14 veils, that is, like we would see a Muslim woman wearing a veil. But Sufis believe that birth is the first veil, death is the last veil, and that life is a series of veils that you remove to see God better. And that there's one special veil that if you take that away, you can see God face to face. Well, the Apostle Paul mentions in 2 Corinthians, speaks about when a man turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. So this is a verse that I like to use with Sufis because they are very acquainted with veils. And so the Apostle Paul speaks about when Moses wore a veil and And then he goes from that to talk about how that Satan has veiled the world, but that when a man turns to the Lord, the veil's taken away. So if you're dealing with a Sufi, you have to deal with how they're thinking, which they don't care about doctrine. They care about experience. And the way you experience God is by taking off the veil. So I know this might be a little bit new to most of the listeners out there, but folk religion is as deep, particularly folk Islam, is as deep as someone wants to go.
Would you say that some of those same principles and distinctions would carry over into other forms of folk religion outside of Islam? Do you see, for example, charismatic type movements among folk variations of other major world religions? Is there a similar folk mindset there that you see those same principles holding true?
Yes, I really do, especially with Buddhism. So I've taken, I never worked as a missionary in Asia. My experience has been in sub-Saharan Africa, in South America, and in North Africa. But I've taken a lot of trips with students. And so I work with one of our IMB folks who now he's back in the States, but he worked in Burma, which is now Myanmar. And in Myanmar, which is a Buddhist country, and you see lots of men and women who are Buddhist monks or nuns, but in Myanmar, they have a spirit that's called a gnat, N-A-T. Now, not the gnats that you swipe, when there's a lot of bugs around. That's a different kind of gnat. But these gnats, same word, are I guess you would call them small gods. And so they have features. And so if you go to a Buddhist temple in Myanmar, you'll see next to the gods, the Buddhas, these little gnats. And so people make their offerings to the gnats more than they do the Buddha, because the gnat spirits, and they're not ancestor spirits, they are the traditional gods of the Burmese before the arrival of Buddhism around.
It almost sounds like the Fae. It almost sounds like what became in pop culture fairies, but that same idea of these kind of airy spirits that are just there. They're maybe divine or semi-divine, but not quite. They're not ancestral spirits. They're just living in that middle space.
Yeah, that's a good point. And they're only in Myanmar, because I have some friends that work in Thailand, and my son lived in Cambodia for a while, and they're not in those countries, but instead they're just there in Myanmar, and they're called gnats. So, and I would just call that folk Buddhism, really. Now, with Hinduism, all of Hinduism is really folk religion. In fact, Hinduism, the definition of it is that Hinduism are just the traditional practices of the peoples of South Asia. Now, Hinduism, I was just teaching that this morning in a world religions class, so it's fresh in my mind. But the Hindu doctrines developed in around 180 BC until 900 AD. So what we think of Hindu doctrines like, karma and reincarnation, those were fairly recent, but Hindu practices were just worshiping different gods, prior to the modern doctrines that we think of with Hinduism. But I wanted to tell you a funny story about folk. I was just reminded of it. This just happened 3 weeks ago when I was in South Asia. And so what we did, we went into these mosques, and we just struck up conversations. And this particular mosque was kind of wide open, so you didn't actually go inside. It was like open air mosque. And so we had prearranged an appointment with someone that was at the mosque 2 days before, but I was teaching a class of some pastors, so I wasn't there. So we arranged this appointment with our translator and this one of my students and then myself. So we were talking to this guy. So the Sufis, and this guy was a Sufi, it was a Sufi mosque, they wear beads. And there's 33 beads, and maybe, I don't know if you've seen the beads in your part of the Muslim world where you live, but they're very common in the Sufi world. In fact, you can usually tell a Sufi because they're wearing the beads. And they count 33 beads 3 times, and that gets the 99 names of God. And so they do that. That's called, and I failed to mention this earlier, the main worship in Sufi Islam is called the dhikr. That's the Arabic term. It means remembrance. And when you remember the 99 names of God, that supposedly gets you in a mindset to really worship God and really concentrate on him. So I was sitting there witnessing to this man and talking to him about the Lord. I said, well, I see you're wearing beads. I says, what do those beads do for you? He says, well, I count these beads. And he said, and of course he was more of a layman than he was a theologian. He says, so if I see a really nice looking girl walking by, I concentrate on my beads so I can focus on what I'm supposed to be focusing on.
So I had a couple experiences. I had a friend that I had become very close to, and he went back to his hometown and came back and gave my boys when they were very young, each of them a little bracelet with the blue beads with the white and the black, the evil eye beads. And he had given them to my boys. And so we had this really kind of an awkward exchange, which I didn't know how to handle. But eventually I just told him, I'm like, I can't let my boys wear these because I do believe there's a power at work, but it's not God's power. And I'm not going to do that, which, I don't know how, it didn't hurt our relationship because we were close. But I also know there was another time when I was with another friend. We were in a very remote city in the heart of, Central Asia. And I had seen one of these huge ones, and I knew what it was, but I looked over to my friend and said, see that, that blue, huge, it was a huge blue disc. I mean, it was probably, a foot in diameter. And I asked him, I said, what is that? And he looked at me, and I knew this guy was very religious, and he's a pray 5 times a day kind of guy. And he looked at me and said, oh, that's just a pretty decoration. I said, there's no religious significance at all. And he goes, oh, no. It's just pretty decoration. So is there some aspects of shame that go into people practicing some of these folk beliefs? Or, I mean, why would he respond in that way, do you think, to a question that he and I both knew the answer to?
Good question.
Yeah, that's a good point. In fact, you see a lot of these for sale in jewelry in Egypt. And I tell my students, I said, if you're traveling in the Muslim world, I don't buy one of these things because, you buy them to ward off the evil spirit or the evil eye, or you use it to put the evil eye on someone else. So don't do it. But I think you're absolutely right. What happens is that a more orthodox Muslim, they are ashamed that there are these folk Muslims out there. So they'll do one of two things. They'll either deny its existence, as your friend did, in a sense, or they'll say, "Oh, these people are heretics, and they're, they shouldn't even be called Muslims." And so you get both answers. But yes, there is this feeling about that. I wanted to mention one other thing before I forgot it, because I think it's apropos to what's going on today about folk religion. And so there are some reports that the coronavirus comes from the Wuhan area of China. Well, that's not, that is accepted, but it comes from the wet market. And I was in China way back in 1981, and I was on a tour. Back then, you could only go to 3 cities in China in 1981. And they were very proud and showed me their hospital, but their hospital wasn't a normal hospital. It was just kind of this dried leaves and medicines just spread out on the ground. And they said that was the medicine for healing their people. And so many people think that it's these bat wings and this animal, this mammal called, I think it's pronounced like a ptarmigan or something like that. That's kind of a sloth-like animal. And that why would people use these sorts of medicines in practice? Well, I visited a outdoor market in Taipei, Taiwan, and in that market, they were selling parts of snakes and venom, and you could buy about any kind of thing in the whole world. And they think that the coronavirus, COVID-19, that the origin is in this Chinese folk religion, which is very interesting.
And there's conflicting data, of course, we know on, exactly where it came from. And I'm hearing some news sources actually saying that according to a Chinese study, there may not actually be horseshoe bats for sale within vicinity of some of these wet markets that people are looking at. But there is a Chinese equivalent of their version of the CDC lab in Wuhan there, even though there aren't the bats for sale in the wet market. So it may be more of that. But the point being, what I wonder, and it's true, you should never trust anything any of these, communist dictatorships say. But what I wonder is we also look at the obfuscation of some of the news that's coming out of there. But maybe we need to read that through just a wee bit more of an honor shame lens, because there is shame associated with some of these practices. Is that a valid thought, Dr. Hadaway?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it is. And also in China and other places, rhino horns are very much very valuable. And so rhino horns, they believe, is an aphrodisiac. And so it is sold in some of these markets as well. So that would be pure folk religion, thinking that something like a rhino horn, would be profitable. And so, but the shame and honor is certainly, no one wants to admit that they have leashed a plague on the whole world. And I think if something originated in America, that we would feel the same way.
Yeah, but the implications might be even different of why we would feel the same way. And I think that kind of gets potentially, and that kind of gets the heart of this. It's an understanding of your world and what you value the most that drives you. Which kind of brings up a question that as we get toward the end here, and I really thank you for your time. I really would like to have you come back and talk more about your book as well. Especially if this drags on, you might have more time than you ever thought you'd have. But can you talk a little bit about how can we find our own? Like, I'm sure if someone from the outside were to come into my life and watch my religious practices, they might point out one or two things that they would say, "Wow, Scott, you've really caved to the culture in this area," or you're practicing some element of folk religion in your life that you don't even know. How can we self-evaluate that? Because certainly, when you're in the middle of it, you don't see it. How can Christians, especially evangelical Christians in America, how can we be aware of these tendencies in our life, even maybe toward a non-biblical practice?
Well, of course, it's very hard to do, because the hardest thing is to analyze your own worldview. As someone has said, your worldview is sort of like a fish in water. The fish doesn't really know that it's in water. That's just the given. So it is with our worldview. We think that our interpretation of Christianity is the proper one until perhaps we go to the Middle East and we see a Middle Eastern society where you have, a disciple-master relationship. The Shias, every Shia and every Sufi is supposed to have a sheikh, and they are a disciple of that particular sheikh. And so we don't, I think, see ourselves as disciples of Jesus in the same way that Middle Eastern cultures see discipleship. And so I think we have to read the Bible through the lens of the context, which was the Middle Eastern context. And we can only do that by studying the Word of God.
And I think everything that you're sharing too is relevant for how we do evangelism. We can't assume that people who claim to adhere to any religion or system are just copying and pasting out of those religious texts and textbooks into the construction of their own worldview, right? We're human beings with our own fears, drives, and emotions, and we're going to go off script with any religious system when troubles come in life, and we're looking for creative solutions and turning to the occult. And you see that in Europe, you see that in the West, you see that right in our own backyard here in the States, and maybe in your neighborhood, you have people that have turned to occult practices because people aren't just pre-programmed with one religion or another, but we do tend to mix and match, and even as believers, we are still prone to that sin of idolatry and wanting to control our lives in all of those ways. And yeah, what better way than to return to Christ as the master and us as just his apprentices? So, Dr. Hadaway, how can people learn more about this? You have a book on this coming out next year. You also have a book that is coming out in this May as well, and connect with more of the resources that you've put out over the years.
Well, so I have on May 1st, my book, A Survey of World Missions, which will be published by Robin Hadaway, academic. That can be ordered. Just Google Hadaway and A Survey of World Missions, and you'll see how to order that if you'd like to read more about folk religion in the world religion section. In 2021, the same publisher will be publishing my book on folk Islam. That cannot be ordered yet because it's still a year away, but it's simply an expansion of my world religions chapter, specifically on Islam, folk Islam, and traditional religion. I've also written a number of articles. In fact, I have an article entitled Empty Shelves, which is in the Christian Index. If you Google that, I comment on the coronavirus situation, comparing that to my time in Tanzania, where we were forced to live a life pretty much like now, where there's nothing in the stores, and I had to shoot my own meat, and I had our garden ravaged by monkeys and mongoose. And so it's kind of an interesting read.
Happens to me too.
It's an interesting read. So if you Google my name, I think you'll see some of the articles I wrote. So appreciate that.
And you could also just enroll to attend Midwestern Seminary and hear Dr. Hadaway in person like I did, which has certainly been a blessing to me, and really appreciate you, not just your teaching, but also the life you've lived for Christ with your wife and your family. And I'm grateful for how you're continuing to serve the Lord, and grateful for your time here. And I hope this will be a blessing to our listeners. And we hope to have you on soon again to talk a little bit more about missions. So I'm going to put you on the spot here now so that you have to commit, because it's been almost a year since we tried to get you on the first time.
Yes, Dr. Hadaway, thank you.
I would love to be on again. It's a joy to talk about missions.
There we go. We got him booked. Okay,
we'll get
CJ on this.
You heard it here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. To get more content, go to missionspodcast.com or check out abwe.org/podcast. If you like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, review, and share. To ask a question or suggest a topic, email alex@missionspodcast.com, and we'll see you next time on the Missions Podcast.